Okay, it's New Year's Eve, 2025. It's nighttime. We got fireworks out. I've been reading this book by Edward Bernays, and I wanted to get into it a little bit. Talk about the most interesting parts of it. It's very enlightening book. It goes into the history of propaganda a little bit more in the introduction, really, which wasn't written by Bernays, and how propaganda, really what Edward Bernays calls like modern propaganda, modern propaganda can be used, and what it can be used for, and how effective it can be, and how much of a game changer it can be for whatever means you want to use it for. It's a wide-ranging tool. Propaganda is an old word, For instance, the word had been coined in 1622 when Pope Gregory XV, frightened by the global spread of Protestantism, urgently proposed an addition to the Roman Curia. The Office for the Propagation of the Faith, Congratio de Propaganda Fide, would supervise the Church's missionary efforts in the New World and elsewhere. Quote, they are to take account of and to deal with each and every concern for the spread of the faith throughout the world. So this word propaganda, as far as this author can tell, was first found in the 17th century, used by the Roman Catholic Church. And they were, trying to keep and spread the Catholic interpretation of Christianity to a farther range of people than Protestantism, which Protestantism was developed in Europe and in Western Europe, and was spread with a lot of the colonists that went to Americas, really, into the colonies in North America, and then the different colonies in South America and throughout was called the New World, but wasn't a new world. It was a very old world, and with a lot of history. So the propaganda really comes from like the root word, kind of like to propagate, which just means to spread. It's really a synonym. Propaganda or propagation, or to spread, is a synonym. You propagandize, or you spread propaganda. It could be good propaganda, it could be bad propaganda, it could be, I've said that before, but it can be like very specific propaganda. Like if I'm employed by Clorox and they want to boost sales, me being a good propagandist, as in selling propaganda for Clorox, selling Clorox, I would have to kind of label Clorox in bright colors or something very attractive and associated with cleanliness and affordability and whatever factors that would play to the average consumer, is what I would have to do in my propaganda, in my communication, in my spread of information. And my opinions on the church being what they are, probably they were not spreading something necessarily positive at that point. But propaganda itself is disassociated from whether it's good or bad. It's just communication. So also in the introduction, let's talk about this. Prior to the war, meaning the World War I, the word's derogatory use was far less common than its neutral denotation. Here, for example, is the calm and accurate definition given in the Oxford English Dictionary. Any association, systematic scheme, or concerted movement for the propagation of a particular doctrine or practice. Close quote. So that's a very broad thing, Although the practice had, albeit unnamed, been variously used by governments for centuries, it was not until 1915 that governments first systematically deployed the entire range of modern media to rouse their populations to fanatical assent. So 1915, that's in the middle of World War I. Media and the Industrial Revolution at that time was in full blast. Posters and movies and radio and cars and the spread of information, the spread of technologies and all these different types of things were fast moving, were fast spreading. And modern media like newspapers and radio, eventually TV and movies, and even what you present in like the marketplace, the physical marketplace, how you present your product in the physical marketplace, all of these things were really on the minds of capitalists at that time. And we're benefiting capital in a lot of different ways, and so just for context, this book Propaganda is written by an American, and it's coming from an American sort of lens, point of view, masters of the 20th century, and from a Western perspective, that is what the American propaganda would have most people believe, that the U.S., as for instance, won the war, both world wars, or was main driver in winning and stopping the spread of evil, undemocratic, sort of savagery, death and destruction throughout the world. That was part of the propaganda campaign that the U.S. government was embarking on, to first, enlist people to fight in the war, in both wars, but also for the public in general, as a whole, to invest in the war, take up posts, take up jobs that were part of the war economy, be paid in war bonds, accept that people would be paid in war bonds, and that you can trade war bonds in for food and fuel and different things, and the war bonds almost were like a loan, the public loaning the government money and work in exchange for a livelihood. Really, it was a livelihood, and this was very attractive and very successful for the white working class of America during World War I and World War II. After World War I, there was a boon, a capitalist boon, a boost, and that's where you get the roaring 20s. You hear the phrase the roaring 20s. It was when a lot of capitalists were making money hand over fist, and we're making a lot of money, but it led to a mass, I think what's called financialization, and betting on the market and investing in certain companies and entities based on short-term profits, and not based on necessity and public good and what people actually needed and wanted and were able to afford. And these capitalists broke the economy, and then we went into the Great Depression in the late 1920s and early 30s. And World War II and the conflict in Europe, that was part of World War II. There was also an Eastern Front. There was also a Middle Eastern, African aspect to the war as well. And so then we get into the, the beginnings of what being developed into a, world war, big conflicts, and, especially Europe, the fascists had take over Germany, which was a huge industrial power for a long time, and had a lot of, capital and power and influence, and scientific and, industrial and technological and all these different types of things. They had big developments in Germany in the World War I, and the subsequent defeat, and the sanctions, and the life loss, and all this different types of stuff. It really affected the German economy and the German psyche, and German fascists, as a response to, actually German socialists, a democracy push by the working class populace of Germany, that they were actually, socialism was partly born, or well, from a European lens, was born in Germany. So this was the backdrop to Germany at that time. The fascists came to save the capitalists of Germany, because the capitalists proved to lead astray the workers and the working class of Germany, and a section of the working class went fascist, because they were at least scapegoating a minority, and saying that if we just make major changes and try to become a homogeneous sort of a society, then that will solve most of our problems, and we will be rich because of this, and we'll gain richness based on that. And it's a very anti-democratic, very anti-socialistic, public good, diversity message, but it worked in Germany, very homogeneous society. And so, well, not that it worked, but it worked in getting followers and people willing to go to war and conquer and kill a lot of people. So yeah, I mean, we started this with talking about propaganda. Propaganda was used both by, Western governments, as in the U.S. and Britain and France and other different types of governments, to get people to join the war and to invest in the war, but it was used on the other side too for the same purposes. And there was lies on both sides, and there was, at the end of the day, it wasn't the working class of Germany or the working class of Austria or Japan or wherever the war fronts were, Turkey, wherever. It wasn't their choice to go to all-out war where millions of people would die. It wasn't their choice. It was the capitalists of the world that chose, and the governments that supported those ventures and profited off of those capitalist ventures. And it wasn't just capitalists at the time, but it was the old feudal lords at play as well. Some in Germany and some in Asia, and different places that had a lot of decision-making power in the world wars. But because the industrial nation and the capitalist nation of the US came out of the world wars the most economically strong country, because the war wasn't fought on this soil, on US soil. It was fought on foreign lands, and those foreign governments, like Britain and France and all these different types of countries that requested US military assistance and political assistance and financial assistance, the US loaned and provided a lot of, US banks provided a lot of loans and the U.S. military and the industrial base provided a lot of weaponry and resources to Western Europe at that time. So they made out at the end of the war, when it was time to rebuild, these governments had to pay back these loans with interest, and this led to the U.S. being in a very big, very powerful position. So let's get back to some of the quotes in the introduction here. So now public opinion, in quotes, stood out as a force that must be managed, and not through clever guesswork, but by experts trained to do that all-important job. Thus, the war improved the status of those working in the fields of public suasion. The great Allied campaign to celebrate or sell democracy, etc., was a venture so successful, and it seemed so noble, that it suddenly legitimized such propagandists who, once the war had ended, went right to work massaging or exciting various publics on behalf of entities like General Motors, Procter & Gamble, John D. Rockefeller, General Electric, entities, companies, from the public sector to the private sector. So this goes to, kind of understanding of the economy that is not commonly held by people. Most commonly, the economy is understood as, well, technologies are developed by entrepreneurs, inventors historically, but more recently, entrepreneurs, people who come up with ideas or have a good business model, maybe develop a technology, maybe don't, but use a technology in a smart way and an inventive way and have success in business. And they provide something that the public wants and is willing to pay for, and that's how they make their money, and it's just, and it's a public good in that way, in that it's a new technology, it's a new option for people, it's something new, it's something exponential development. That's what capitalism depends on. Well, extracting the value from capital for profit, for forever profit. So that's the common understanding of how developments come to be in capitalism. But historically, the biggest technologies to have ever been developed, the most important, the most innovative, the most life-changing, life-shattering, like atomic energy, for as an example, it can be used for good, it can be used for evil. That's a huge scientific discovery funded by public money, federal public money. Or things like railroads, right? Let's give another example. Railroads, fast-moving technology, feeds development, feeds population expansion, feeds even communication between different populations at a quicker rate, at least in the when it was first developed in the 18th, 19th century, whenever trains started. And that was a public works project. Railroads were public works projects. The government invested in not just railroads being built across the country, but also the highways, the U.S. highway system. That's a public expenditure. And the benefits get accrued, and the profit and the value gets accrued, not in favor of the public, but in favor of the private, most of the time in the society. So, for instance, right, as an example, so that those railroads were developed and funded by just going back to this by the public sector, right? But then eventually, once these things get established and these technologies get worked out, and the realization of the money that can be made with these things, well, it's not like it's learned after the fact. The reason why these things spread and get developed this way is because of the money motive. There's profit in it. Even it goes back to early U.S. history too, like Manifest Destiny. The U.S. government advocating for colonists. People who lived in Eastern U.S. that came historically from immigrant families in Europe that took over lands of the Native Americans in the East. They were encouraged by the U.S. government to spread west, to go conquer lands west. And, what does the U.S. government get from that? The U.S. government gets to claim that their citizenry, the ones that are willingly going and conquering lands that are not theirs, that in the end, the U.S. can draw boundaries around those lands and say that this is all the U.S. In exchange for the public going and conquering those lands, they get to profit and make a stake in, or have a stake in, the profits of developing that capital. Land is capital, and that land and whatever gets produced on it, those, if you work it, manifest destiny, manifest your own destiny, then you can be rich, and you can be an industrialist, and you can be a modern man, a true American patriot, somebody who's propagating the American way, the American dream, the true capitalist way of doing things. And this was also propaganda, but it wasn't necessarily called that at the time. Propaganda is has been popularized in the 20th century and this century, and it has negative connotations because of its association with war, and how it was used in the war effort, okay, even by the West. So here, for example, that reborn generation of admin and publicists, no longer common hucksters but professionals, sold their talents to big business. So this quote here is very interesting. That reborn generation of admin and publicists. Reborn meaning they were something before, and now they're reborn into something new. They were no longer common hucksters, but professionals. So this makes me think of like 19th century, 1800s, 1700s, old movies, cowboy movies even, traveling salesmen, right? Traveling salesmen, people who are propagandists trying to sell a company's wares on the road. Snake oil salesmen as well, or traveling preachers. These are all versions of propagandists, people who are communicating to the public, trying to sell people on a vision or on a product. But modernity and industrialization and the capital that was accumulated in the U.S. after the World Wars opened up, a professional position for propagandists. Propagandists now were really in need by these companies, because these companies that were given these technologies by the government, by the public sector, we're now trying to sell these technologies as products to the public. Okay, so as an aside, but not really, like the propaganda and the root word of like propagate or propagate is, like I said, to spread, and to spread what? The what that you're spreading, doesn't matter. It could be anything. We as humans and we as living beings, to go philosophical with it, are made in a way with an instinct to propagate, continuously spread. And it comes in the form of having children. It comes in a lot of different forms as well. Our desire to communicate through language, to develop language to the fullest extent, and to use it to communicate our thoughts as succinctly and as well as we can, so that another person can understand us, can be us, can feel us, acknowledge our existence. Really, that is us propagating ourselves as well. When we communicate, or our desire to communicate is based on a propagation instinct. We are incredibly social creatures that need each other to survive, and it's only makes sense that we have this instinct to propagate. Is for survival's sake. Is an evolutionary adapted feeling. Okay, so on page 12 in the introduction, the author writes that proponents of propaganda, of the craft, often kept referring to the word quietly. They knew that they were propagandists, and they were using propaganda, but because of the negative connotation the propaganda was acquiring, because of their own anti-East propaganda, that they just referred to the word and to the methods quietly, behind closed doors. And here's an interesting quote that I have a lot to say about. According to the propagandists, evangelical self-salesmanship, many of them were in fact the sons of ministers, their revolutionary science would do far more than make some people richer. Just as during the war, propaganda would at once exalt the nation and advance the civilizing process, teaching immigrants and other folks of modest means how to transform themselves through smart consumption into happy and presentable Americans. So that's on page 13. And this is a very interesting point because it goes to the different philosophies at play during the time in American history. America, even though we like to say it's a democracy, it's a republic, and we have freedom of religion here. There's a separation of church and state. Church has always had, and a specific church, the Christian church, has always had major influence in politics, in society, in economics, in culture, especially. And a lot of the propagandists of the 1920s and on have themselves a Christian religious background, as referenced here, that many of them were sons of ministers, and that propaganda as this new revolutionary science, in quotes, had an effect that you can civilize people and transform people in almost in a religious sense, because religion also advocated for that too. It was a promotion of a more civilized human being, with morals, that is godly, that is heavenly, that is free of sin. And this American nationalist propaganda was playing on those long-held tropes in religion of civilizing people, of transforming the non-believers just now. But, in a modern sense, the modern capitalists are not, trying to, pass around a basket in hopes for handouts from people to build churches, and to build the wealth of the Vatican. That's not what they care about. They care about now making money for themselves and their enterprises. So that's where the smart consumption comes in. And then the want to convince people to consume. On this day, December 31st, New Year's Eve, is a huge propaganda day, full of propaganda. It's on TV, it's everywhere. There's a high incentive to stay up late, to drink, to buy alcohol, to party, to buy snacks, to get people together, to watch celebrities on TV espousing non-controversial takes and pro-consumption takes. And it's all pro-consumption because where are these parties taking place? Where are these TV shows taking place, and what are they promoting? They're selling advertising non-stop. New Year, the New York ball drop is centered in New York City and in Times Square. Basically a billboard mecca, and that's where it's, a lot of people gravitate towards seeing that and being there and the spectacle of that. Well, that spectacle is something created. It's something created by capitalists to get us to consume more. And this was written a long time ago. So smart consumption maybe was the sell back then, but there's no veil of smart consumption nowadays. Okay, it's just consumption for consumption's sake. It's, let me sell you this new phone even though you don't need it. Sell you this new flavored chip even though it's bad for you. There's nothing smart about the purchase, etc., etc. I mean, so let's go on here. Throughout the 1920s, as propaganda's earnest advocates devoutly pushed the faux progressive line, propaganda seemed, at least to those who peddled it, a wondrous new progressive force capable of brightening every life and every home. This just says to me, like, this is the lies you tell yourself, these propagandists and Edward Bernays himself, propagandists for propaganda. You have to sell it as a positive. You have to sell this sort of thing as, something good for the consumer. Because how else are you going to get somebody to buy it? No one's going to pay money for something that willingly that they don't have to, unless they think it's going to, benefit them. For instance, let's go back to the example of the highways, the U.S. highways, right? Why would the U.S. federal government invest in a massive public roads initiative across the thousands of miles across the U.S. if there was no positive on the other side? Well, there was. It was in the form of oil companies, car manufacturers, metal companies, all these different types of industrial markets that sprouted up during the Industrial Revolution, they all profited. Ford Motors, they lobbied the government to do this, what was called a public works, project, that was for the public, but it wasn't for the public, it was for the private. If we were trying to create a cross-country transportation system that was, efficient, cost-effective, fast, non-pollutant, good for life, good for human life, the health of this ecosystem, we would have built trains. We would have been trying to build and develop more efficient, more greener trains quicker, and that's not what we did. We promoted the car and the individual purchase of an automobile, something that can get you and your family to different places that you would like to go, per se, but like the cost on society is individual and is not the public or the government investing for the public. It's the money is going to go into private hands. If everybody has a car, everybody has to buy gas, and I said my piece. So on page 13, like its wartime prototype, the post-war propaganda drive was an immense success, as it persuaded not just businessmen, but journalists and politicians that the manufacture of consent, in Walter Lippmann's famous phrase, was a necessity throughout the public sphere. So yeah, the manufacture of consent was seen by this, the class of people as necessary to keep people at bay, to keep the working class at bay from demanding their slice of the profits in society. In the US, the US was selling a vision at this time of a progressive, democratic, and civilized future. And this promotion and this uptick in goods for sale and credit lines and even the ability for the normal man to invest in the stock market, invest in shares of privately held companies as an investment, is all selling a vision for capitalism that promotes U.S. capitalist interests. And it's sold as progressive, meaning it's progress, it's better than what we had before. It's sold as democratic, as in something that we all have a say in, that we all like, that is a public good. And it's sold as civilized. It's better than the old ways. But all three, in a lot of ways, are not true, and are hypocritical, statements. I mean, they, progressive in what sense? Sure, like certain technologies and certain advancements in medicine and health and food and science, promotion of science and discoveries about, health impacts and how the ecosystem works and the basics of life need to be met. This was all discovered by science in the 20th century, or a lot of it was discovered by science in the 20th century. So I'm not negating that there was progress in that sense, but the benefits of these discoveries, the benefits that can be accrued from these technologies, were held in majority private hands, majority, capitalist hands. And it wasn't progress necessarily for the majority of people throughout the US, throughout the world. And it wasn't democratic and it wasn't civilized. We're speaking about a time where women didn't have the right to vote. Many women weren't allowed in the workplace. And, it was a way more patriarchal sort of society. At the same time, too, there was immense, institutional racism. Minority communities were not allowed any power in this country, any political power at all. So democratic for who? Democratic and progressive for who? And civilized, it's not civil to subjugate minorities or women or whoever. And it's also not civilized to outsource, misery the way that, U.S. capitalists were doing. During this time in the beginning of the 20th century, the U.S. was busy fulfilling the Monroe Doctrine around the Americas. U.S. companies were exploiting the workers of South America, of Latin America, of the Caribbean. It was we had colonies in Cuba, we had Puerto Rico, U.S. Virgin Islands, Philippines, Hawaii. U.S. companies were in Venezuela, were in Colombia and Brazil. Capitalists were doing damage. Were not being civil at all. But these are the lies you tell your society, to manufacture consent for this uncivilized sort of way of doing things. And another point that I want to make about selling these types of things as progressive, what they mean as well to say is that this is as good as it's ever been and ever will be. That in America, in this democracy, this is the epitome of human evolution. It can't get better than this. Everybody can vote. Everybody has an opportunity to be in the workforce. There's education opportunities. There's, this is, and there's technologies, and if you work hard enough and pull yourself up by your bootstraps, we have an American dream. Anybody can be successful. Manifest your own destiny. It's a great propaganda. I mean, the U.S. is where propaganda really has been specialized, has been epitomized. But these are lies, these are lies. As good as it's ever been and ever will be, well, there's a lot of people in poverty in the U.S. And there was back then as well when this was written. So it can't be better than this. There has to be a perpetual underclass. There has to be a perpetual global underclass. That's what this is inferring when people say this is as good as it's ever been and ever will be. And alternate economic orders, alternate political orders are painted with this U.S. Capitalist propaganda as worse, always anti-democratic, anti-progress, backward. For instance, the 1917 Russian Revolution, the second there was a revolution, and it was seen and painted as, these are the Prussian hordes, these are, backwards people. They are of the East, they're not civilized. They took control of the means of production. They took power away from capitalists, and the same with the Cuban Revolution, the same with, many different sorts of alternate ways of structuring your society, they're seen as anti-democratic. And I butchered, not butchered it, but so another thing I wanted to say is that the propagandists, like modern propagandists, according to Edward Bernays, were basically born out of the industrial capital boom post the world wars. Like the US was at the top of the world economically after the world wars, because the US economy was not destroyed like the European economies were destroyed by the wars. Not just the economies, the countries were destroyed. Like thousands, if not millions, of people were killed in Europe and around the world, and infrastructure was decimated. Crop supplies were polluted and decimated because of the bombings. The education base was in tatters. A lot of book burnings happened during World War II. The Nazi regime and the fascists in Italy, and these are anti-intellectual politics that we're talking about. They were ruling, Germany and Italy at the time. Is very similar to what to what's happening right now. It has a lot of energy to it. Good propaganda could really, promote, and can move a lot of people, can affect a lot of lives. For instance, 2001, after 9/11, the US government actively propagandized and had the help of the mainstream media, and convinced and pressured people and manipulated the minds of a scared populace because of the terrorist attacks, that we needed to go to war, and that we needed people to enlist based on nationalist pride, based on getting our revenge in a way, protecting our land, and as a preventative measure for any terrorist attacks in the future. Even though the results show that our interventions and wars that we committed, and the mass death that the U.S. military committed in the Middle East, resulted in the wider proliferation, the expansion of terrorism in the world. It didn't get rid of terrorism in the world, it expanded terrorism in the world, and caused a lot of life loss of not just people in Iraq and Afghanistan and other countries around that region, but also a lot of American soldiers. But the propaganda did its job. It got people convinced that this was a just war, at least at the beginning, and it used a lot of the people in the media used and played on certain prejudices that were held by the American public at the time, Islamophobic prejudices, playing on that, otherizing a whole group of people, like 1 billion plus people, Muslim people. There's a lot of people in this world that are Muslim, and they are not inherently inferior or bad people, but that is what the media alluded to and used that to tug at the psyche of people that were predisposed to think that way, that were a little, had racist, understandings, and continue to have racist understandings. That playbook is still played. You can see it in, the coverage of Zohran Mamdani in New York. He's a Muslim man. He happens to be a democratic socialist. So the right-wing media and the corporate liberal media, which is two branches of the same tree, they allude to how he will bring about the intifada in New York City, as using intifada as a pejorative, and that as a negative, and that he will try to bring about communism and evil and corruption and destitution for the people of New York. Sprinkling in this notion that Muslims are barbaric in their understanding of politics and of their society building and stuff like this, and that they're very controlling and very restrictive, very traditional, and so they allude to that being what Mamdani wants in New York, which has no basis in reality. Everything points to the man being what he says he is a democratic socialist. He wants to pass certain policies within the capitalist order, not changing the capitalist order, but within the capitalist order, changing certain policies to better benefit the public, using public funds in a more efficient and prosperous way for the public. Maybe not spending so much on police budgets, and maybe spending more money on free public transport, or maybe having a publicly run grocery store with prices fixed at a certain rate for people of the community that are having trouble affording these high inflated costs of groceries, that they have a cheaper option in the area. And that itself can be used as a sort of like inflation reducer as well, because then all these grocery stores that are also in the area that are privately run, they will have this competition of the publicly run grocery store. These are certain social democratic policies that Mamdani has advocated, talked at length about, and says he's going to try to do. This is now I'm recording January 1st. This is January 1st is going to be his first day in office, so we'll see. But back to propaganda. So propaganda touches everything, and so me, very interested in the human condition, what we do, how we communicate, how we build society, how can we make it better, what's bad about it, what can we change, all this type of stuff. Propaganda is a very important component that is used to the fullest by the powers that be. And for me, somebody who wants to kind of counteract that and fight against it and be part of the movement that changes the system, we got to know our enemy. I've said before, but I say again, in case this is the first time somebody's listening to this podcast, when I read, I've been trying to read. This podcast is not anything set in stone, right? Like, I criticize different things, whether it be movies, books that I read, things that I'm seeing in the media, stuff like this. It's good to critique and analyze all these things, because they're all they all have significance. Everything has significance, and some things more than others. And it's easy to just get lost in the, I'm trying to find a way to say it, but it's like very easy to get lost in the propaganda. So this is what I mean when I say that, the public sector and the government invested in certain technologies and then gave it to the private sector. Okay, it's a notion of like socializing risk and cost while privatizing profit. Okay, so here's something that I looked up that is a good thing to mention here. The state acts as the initial risk taker. Okay. The argument is that the foundational, high-risk, and capital-intensive research that leads to major technological breakthroughs is frequently funded by the public through government agencies like the Department of Defense, NIH, NSF, and DARPA. The government bears the immense risk of failure. Once the technology is de-risked and proven viable, it is then transferred, often at minimal cost and with generous intellectual property rights, to private corporations which commercialize it and capture the resulting profits. This is not an accident, but a deliberate feature of the U.S. developmental state, which is less visible than in countries with more overt industrial policy. Number one, so the state as the initial risk taker. All right. Private firms often avoid early stage research because it's uncertain, expensive, and the payoff is distant. The state fills this gap. Here's the path of the technology transfer. Number two, the pathway is typically public taxes that fund the government, that turn into government grants and contracts that are given to universities and corporate research, then prototype development, then licensing and spin-off to the private sector, then the private sector creates a commercial product to sell, and they receive private profits once they sell it. So here's the ideological consequence of this. So Noam Chomsky, because I had to remember that Noam Chomsky has talked about this many times before, and this is where I learned about the concept. He argues that this creates a paradox, okay? The success of this model fuels the myth of the innovative, risk-taking private sector, while downplaying the essential foundational role of public investment and collective effort. Here are some examples. The internet. The internet originated as ARPANET, a project of the Pentagon's DARPA program in the 1960s and 70s. For decades, its development and standardization were funded by the U.S. government and conducted in public universities and labs. In the mid-1990s, though, the network was commercialized. The infrastructure and protocols developed with public money became the backbone for private internet service providers, or ISPs, and corporations like Google, Amazon, and Facebook, which built trillion-dollar empires on this public foundation. Other examples, pharmaceuticals and medicine. So the National Institutes of Health, NIH, is the world's largest funder of biomedical research, spending over $40 billion annually in taxpayer money. It funds basic research into disease pathways, drug targets, and clinical trials. But pharmaceutical companies often license this publicly funded research for a nominal fee. They then invest in the final stages of development, which is formulation, specific trials, and marketing, securing patents and setting high prices. Key examples include Taxol, which is a cancer drug. The NIH funded the discovery and early development. Rights were given to Bristol Myers Squibb, which made billions off Taxol. HIV and AIDS drugs. The key foundational research was publicly funded. Another example, the mRNA vaccine. The critical basic research that led to COVID-19 vaccines was funded for decades by the NIH and DARPA. Moderna and BioNTech/Pfizer then developed and profited immensely from the specific vaccines. Another example, touchscreens and smartphones. Public fund, so for example, multi-touch technology was pioneered largely with grants from the NSF and CIA. Key research was done at public universities. This research was commercialized by companies like Fingerworks, later acquired by Apple, becoming the core interface of the iPhone and iPad, cornerstones of Apple's market dominance. So there's the theme right there, okay? These are major technologies that are the face of the modern world, you know, the internet, smartphones, the pharmaceuticals that keep people alive and save people's lives. These were all for I mean, we can't say every single one, but many of the technologies of the modern age were publicly funded, publicly financed. But does the public get to profit off of our investment? We're investing. This is taxpayer money, according to them, you know. Where is this investment going to in terms of like how does this end up benefiting the people if we have to pay for it on the front end, and then because they allow the private sector to take control of these technologies, we then have to pay for it a second time on the back end. So we are the ones investing, and then we're also the ones paying for the final product. It doesn't make much sense. So if you're interested in that kind of concept of like, you know, public funding and then, you know, socializing risk and privatizing profit, you know, there's you know, some sources out there to look at. You know, you can look at like I said, Chomsky on his book, you know, The Profit Over People. He talks a little bit about that. There's a book called, and a documentary called Requiem for the American Dream. There is, you know, you can look up him talking about the myth of the free market. There's also this other sources that look very interesting that I like to look into. And there's this book called The Entrepreneurial State, Debunking Public versus Private Sector Myths by Mariana Mazzucato, which it says that this book systematically documents the phenomena, arguing that the state is not just a fixer for market failures, but the boldest, most innovative risk taker. She provides exhaustive case studies, the iPhone's components, biotech and pharma, and green energy. She is the most direct, detailed, and policy-focused source on this topic. So anyway, we're getting away from propaganda, but I just wanted to mention that because that's part of this whole thing, and this is not something that Edward Bernays mentions, which is hence why they, like the crafty propagandists try to never explicitly accept the term. You know, they use it. Well, they never, accept the term or use it to describe their work, but they refer to it quietly, like I told you before. So with Bernays and his purpose in writing about propaganda, which came out in 1928, he was a big proponent of the word. He himself was a big propagandist. So here's a quote from page 15. Bernays attempts to rid the word of its bad smell. His motivation would appear to be twofold. Bernays always deemed himself to be both a truth seeker and a propagandist for propaganda, as he put it in another Apologia in 1929. On the one hand, then, his interest would be purely scientific, and so his effort to redeem the word is based to some extent on intellectual necessity, there being no adequate substitute for propaganda. So, on page 16, talks about where Bernays gets his vision. Bernays derives this vision from the writings of his intellectual hero, Walter Lippmann, whose classic Public Opinion had appeared in 1922. From his observations on the Allied propaganda drives and immense success, and his own stint as a U.S. war propagandist, and from his readings of Gustave Le Bon, Graham Wallas, and John Dewey, among others, Lippmann had arrived at the bleak view that the, in quotes, democratic El Dorado, unquote, is impossible in modern mass society, whose members, by and large, incapable of lucid thought or clear perception, driven by herd instincts and mere prejudice, and frequently disoriented by external stimuli, were not equipped to make decisions or engage in rational discourse. Democracy, in quotes, therefore requires a supra-governmental body of detached professionals to sift the data, think things through, and keep the national enterprise from blowing up or crashing to a halt. Although mankind surely can be taught to think, that educative process will be long and slow. In the meantime, the major issues must be framed, the crucial choices made by the responsible administrator. It is on the men inside, working under conditions that are sound, that the daily administration of society must rest. These were the opinions of Walter Lippmann and Bernays, that democracy is just not feasible for the average man. The average person is not capable of creating their own world, or deciding for themselves, or interpreting the world and creating their own society. They need to be shaped, molded, led, decisions made for people, and that there are certain people that are responsible administrators, people who are the smart people in society, that can decide for us and keep, this is a very important phrase here, but the national enterprise going. The national enterprise. These are people who think that nationalistically, like in a nationalist sort of way, where it's flag over people in a way. But the enterprise part is very important, because it's the national enterprise. It evokes state capitalism, okay? It evokes the ability in this country of private property rights, okay? that is the sacred holy grail of this country, of our national enterprise. And anything that threatens that ability of private property rights and power being held in private hands and responsible administrator hands, not just private hands, but as long as the government hands are holding up those property rights, them too, they are the responsible administrators as well. Anyway, I'm staying a lot in this introduction because he sums up the book and sums up, the worldview of Bernays and also people like Walter Lippmann very well. And it's important to know who the author is. This is very important to know who the author is. And here's another thing that goes to how Bernays is. On page 17, here's a quote. Although purporting vaguely to be one of us, it soon becomes clear that Bernays sees himself as an exemplar of that elevated supervisory network, just as he sees his own profession as the most important one up there. Thus, Bernays proceeds as both a truth seeker and a propagandist for propaganda. For while he did believe wholeheartedly in his hierarchical conception of democracy, propaganda is primarily a sales pitch, not an exercise in social theory. In other words, while Propaganda, the book, is by no means an exhaustive treatment of its subject, the book is edifying for its own propaganda tactics and for the light it sheds obliquely on the hidden zeal with which most winning propagandists do their work. So when we say, or when it says a truth seeker and a propagandist for propaganda, a truth seeker is kind of ironic, is not really a truth seeker per se. But he is definitely a propagandist for propaganda. Is that a confusing term? For some, it might be. So let me try to break that down. It just means that he thinks that propaganda is the shit, that it's a very powerful way of communicating. He's really talking about modern propaganda. So like ad people, advertising and this new sector of public relations. He talks about public relations a lot and how every public sector, private sector entity, even, individual celebrities, individual politicians, they should all have a public relations person that advises them and that works to push out their product, push out their message, push out their fame, whatever they require of this public relations person. He was showing with this book how powerful propaganda can be. And at the end of the day, he wasn't, he didn't discover anything new. He was just, pointing out, stuff that is true. Propaganda and how you use it is a very powerful force, and it just means communication. It just means, how you advertise, communicate, how you spread a message can determine how that message is received. If you do it in a smart way, in a meticulous way, and also a convincing and manipulative way, because all of this can be manipulative as well, then you might get some good results out of it. You know, that's what he believed, and that's what he, you know, that's what he did as a job, as a career. So these quotes go to what I was saying. This is page 18. Propaganda of the book, is aimed mainly at Bernays' potential corporate clientele, and yet the author variously masks that plutocratic bias. At the outset, his seductive use of us implies that he, like most of us, is just a fuddled propagandee, and not himself the ablest of invisible governors. In chapter 1, he further mystifies the status of his usual customers by casting propaganda as a sort of populist endeavor, and not as an expensive game that is played best by those who have the most to spend on it. There's a very important point made by Mark Miller, the writer of the introduction here. Who can afford to hire a public relations guy or gal? Who can afford to have an advertising division for their product or vision of the world, whatever you want to sell, whatever you want to communicate? Who can afford this? It's the rich, it's the already powerful that can afford these sorts of things and further their enterprise with propaganda. Average Joe that wants to, you know, get their, you know, let's say their barn fixed or their barn, you know, built and wants some help, you know, can't hire a whole, ad campaign. You know, you can't put up a billboard and say, hey, you know, is there anybody in this area, you know, willing to help me to build this barn? You know, I would be willing to pay, you know, this, or maybe I can exchange, this work, and I can work for you doing something else or something like this. You know, you help me, I help you. They would have to, you know, themselves post something maybe in the local bar, in the local marketplace, maybe a flyer, maybe ask some neighbors. That's how they would communicate. That's how they would propagandize. But it's not as effective as a big ad campaign. It's easier to promote, you know, to get things out there, to get, you know, themes and ideas out in the ether, in the zeitgeist, if you have a lot of money, if you have a lot of capital. And this is me, very socialist minded, this is part of the reason why, you know, socialism has a very hard time, you know, self-propagating itself in society, because socialists tend to be, you know, the working class. I mean, that's the base of socialism, is the working class. There's nothing, socialism doesn't exist without the working class. And the working class, you know, live paycheck to paycheck, or you know, are in debt, or are struggling, and don't have disposable income to spread the message of socialism, and then, you know, the other side, the capitalist side, is constantly spending money to promote capitalism and to denigrate socialism. So socialism only grows through the grassroots, you know, and propaganda can be used, and even mass propaganda can be used by socialists, but it's harder to be able to do it because of these intrinsic sort of disparities. You know, capital disparities are what they are. So I don't know, I just wanted to make that point. Here's another quote. The book is most instructive when it tells us how and why Bernays did what he did for his mostly corporate clients. There are many such revealing moments here. For every case of winning propaganda cited in the book, was actually Bernays' own handiwork. The casual reader sees no egotism in such self-promotion, as Bernays discreetly slips into the passive voice each time he tells us what was done or shown or proven with extraordinary deftness. He had no equal as a propaganda strategist. So this just is describing how throughout the book, Bernays gives a lot of examples, which is really good, you know. He gives a lot of examples of like different propaganda campaigns and different propaganda tactics that have been used during that era by different companies, by different governmental agencies to get what they want, either more sales or more people, pro-war or etc., etc. But he doesn't ever mention explicitly that the examples that he's using are literally things that he was the propagandist for. He was the one hired by these companies to do the propaganda that he himself is giving the examples of what he did. And he doesn't mention that. He just uses passive voice to say that, oh, these things were done and this was effective because, yeah, these things were done as if they weren't done by him. He's obfuscating the fact that it's a sales pitch. He's very sly. He's a master manipulator. Let's go to some quotes here that kind of talk about the myth of like objectivity. Page 20. Bernays sold the myth of propaganda as a wholly rational endeavor, carried out methodically by careful experts skilled enough to lead public opinion. The propagandist rules. The propagandized do whatever he would have them do, exactly as he tells them to, and without knowing it. For self-conscious professionals, such as Bernays, expert detachment was, of course, a point of pride and a strong selling point, as that hard attitude provided tacit reassurance to potential clients that the propagandist worked not just by instinct or mood, but as impartially and, if need be, ruthlessly as any doctor or attorney. He could work others up without getting all worked up himself. So Edward Bernays was made it seem like, this is an objective sort of endeavor. Like I don't have any bias. If you hire me, I have no bias either way. You hire me, I'm gonna do the job. Page 21. Indeed, the same myth of the unmoved mover has been amply reconfirmed by some of history's most effective agitators. Hitler liked to cast himself as a detached appraiser of his own frenzies at the podium, and Goebbels too believed himself to be completely cold inside, even as his oratory thrilled the crowd. There is no way to confirm this notion that the propagandist is essentially above the fray that he creates. While it surely points us towards some truths about the way that demagogues and other propagandists operate, the notion is unlikely on its face. From what we know about the most ferocious demagogues of yesteryear, successful mass incitement does tend to bespeak and seemingly requires a fiery core of radical commitment, even if the agitator consciously distorts his facts or trots out this or that rhetorical device. Hitler, Goebbels, Mussolini, Father Coughlin, Joe McCarthy, Gerald L.K. Smith, and many others were fanatical and cynical at once, neither wholly in control nor totally ecstatic. Such agitators work within a certain mental borderland where one can never clearly see conviction as distinct from calculation. Indeed, that inner murkiness appears itself to be the very source or basis of the mass manipulator's enigmatic power, and so we cannot comprehend it through schematic dualistic formulas. Orwell's elusive concept of doublethink is highly pertinent here. Close quote. So, this is a tough concept to understand for me, but I feel like I understand it. So I think what is being asserted here by Bernays and by Mark Miller, what he's trying to analyze, is that always tend to promote themselves as objective, that what they're saying is just based on reality, based on facts, and if passion is even part of their oratory or their way of selling something, is because of the facts, is because of the objective reality that what they're pushing is true and good and pro the public. It's is good for the public. But nobody is objective. This is my interpretation. Nobody is objective. This is also part of the reason why the media, when it says that they see that they just call balls and strikes, is bullshit. It's not right. It is not true. Everybody has a bias. Every human has a bias. And somebody like Bernays, who, let's say, work for Ford Motors or whatever, General Motors or whatever, his bias, because General Motors is paying him, is towards General Motors. And if General Motors wants to lie to the public that they have the fastest car ever built or the most, the best car ever built without providing facts, Edward Bernays is going to sell that. But he's going to sell it as if it's a fact. It might not be a misleading, maybe Ford had the best cars at the time. It could have been. It probably was, but it doesn't matter. It's just propagandists tend to paint themselves as unbiased and like to think themselves to be unbiased, but there is a bias there. There is a bias, and that's why Mark Miller alludes to the doublethink thing. You can think one thing, but you'd also think the other thing without knowing it. Here's another quote here, page 23. To advertise a product, you must believe in it. To convince, you must be convinced yourself, observes Marcel Bluestein-Blanchet, longtime head of Publicis, the giant French ad agency. So this is the head of an ad agency in France, talking about advertising. You gotta convince yourself, you lie to yourself in a way to sell these things. It makes me think, because I'm a big basketball fan, it makes me think of all these players, the best players in the world are young, they're in their 20s, and they don't just make money from playing basketball, but they make money by doing advertising for different companies, whether it be Sprite or Nike or whatever. And they themselves, are in tip-top shape. The ones who take their health the most serious, they don't eat Doritos. They don't drink Sprite. Maybe some do, maybe some don't, but some don't. And yet, they live a very healthy, regimented lifestyle. But they are willing, because of the money on the table. Most people would take that money on the table. Obviously, if an additional, $1 million a year for just doing a quick little ad read, yeah, I'm gonna convince myself that selling this Sprite to kids across the nation, even though it's full of sugars and addictive chemicals and doesn't promote a healthy lifestyle like the one I'm living, is worth it. you convince yourself to sell these things. Here are some examples of some projects that Edward Bernays himself worked on. In 1929, for instance, Bernays mounted Light's Golden Jubilee. This grand occasion, featuring a much-hyped joint appearance of Thomas Edison and Henry Ford, was ostensibly an earnest and spontaneous celebration of the 50th anniversary of Edison's invention of the light bulb. In fact, the Jubilee was but a stroke of propaganda on behalf of General Electric and its National Electric Light Association, NELA, which was the secret means of General Electric's stranglehold on America's electric power. From 1919 until 1934, NELA carried out the largest peacetime propaganda drive in U.S. history, intended to discourage public ownership of the utilities. That private capital should wield complete control over the nation's power supply was a notion evidently not to be debated. We talked about public ownership versus private ownership, and this is one of those examples. Bernays helped General Electric put on this show with the famous Thomas Edison and the famous Henry Ford. It was probably, all over the newspapers, all over the press. It was this grand jubilee thing. And they threw this party to promote that, the light bulb, it's been such an amazing invention, and here are the people responsible for it, and the enterprise is responsible for it. Ford and General Motors and General Electric and blah, 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 trying to turn the populace's eyes away from the fact that these utilities don't have to be in the hands of private enterprise. They could be in the public's hands, and we can, and thus we would have more control over them and also have to pay less for them. But propaganda was needed, enlisted by these companies to kind of, bread and circuses. You ever heard that term, bread and circuses? Let's see where that comes from here. The phrase bread and circuses is one that alludes to a political strategy of pacifying the population by providing cheap food and entertainment, thereby preventing unrest and distracting citizens from larger social problems, lack of political freedom, or failures of governance. This example is a failure of governance that the government doesn't have control over the public utilities, over the utilities. And this show, this grand jubilee, whatever it's called, that Edward Bernays, did on behalf of General Electric, is an example of bread and circuses. It is literally a circus. Okay, let's continue here. Here's another example, another project that Bernays was working on. In 1953, Bernays helped put across the myth that Guatemala was at risk of communist subversion, a serviceable legend that the propagandist actually believed, as he makes clear in his memoirs. Bernays was then employed by the United Fruit Company, at whose behest the Eisenhower administration used the CIA to overthrow the democratically elected government of Jacobo Arbenz. Thus was Guatemala forced to start its gruesome modern history as a quasi-fascist oligarchy. From that point on, the bananas and pineapples would continue to be safely picked by inexpensive native labor under careful watch, with all the profits flowing north. The possibility of some other, less explosive non-colonial arrangement was clearly not to be imagined by Bernays, just as United Fruit could not imagine it, and so it never could become a public issue here. Okay, so here's the last quote from the introduction. The audience that he most cared about, it seems, was not the public, and surely not those intellectuals who despised his craft. He wrote for those who understood the value of that craft, and could afford to make it work for them. Even as the people understandably distrusted propaganda more and more, propaganda was becoming ever more pervasive as its sponsors marveled at its victories. That propaganda easily seduces even those whom it most horrifies is a paradox that Bernays grasped completely, and it is one that we must try at last to understand. So that was the introduction written by Mark Crispin Miller in 2004. And we're going to talk about chapter 1 through chapter 3 on the next episode. So thank you for listening, if you're listening, and please follow the program on Substack or YouTube or Instagram, and then Spotify and Apple Podcasts. That's where you can find the podcast as well. And please share it with your friends. Please share it with people who might know about this stuff, might not know about this stuff, who you're worried about consuming too much misinformed propaganda. And because this will be a series, this book, there's a lot to say, and I have a lot of thoughts on this book. So just like the Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which I will eventually finish that series, that book analysis series on Pedagogy of the Oppressed. That's one of my 2026 goals, early 2026 goals. So you can look forward to that. And this podcast is obviously coming out a week after I first started recording. A lot has happened in the world in this week. So we'll be talking about all that and more very soon.
Go fuck your head. And you notice, yeah, you're focused and you notice, yeah, you're focused and you notice, yeah, you're focused and you notice. She told me to pay my contract, so you to give me a hug. Yeah, you're focused and you notice, yeah, you're focused and you notice, yeah, you're focused and you notice, yeah, you're focused and you notice,
Go feel it like
notice. Yeah, you're focused and you
go feel it like
notice. Yeah, you're focused and you
go feel it like
notice. Yeah, you're focused and you
go feel it like feel it like
focused and you notice. Yeah, you're focused and you notice.
feel it like
Focused and you notice. Yeah, you're focused and you notice. She told it.